All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 17th, 1878, 12 white jurors entered a federal courtroom in Cincinnati, Ohio, to deliver a verdict in a lawsuit regarding a woman named Henrietta Wood, a black woman, a former enslaved woman, about 60 years old at this time. Wood was the plaintiff in this case. The defendant was a man named Zebulon Ward, the white man who had enslaved Wood for 25 years before, many of those years after Wood had been legally, technically freed. And now Henrietta Wood was suing Zebulon Ward for $20,000 in reparations. So here to discuss the case of Henrietta Wood, the plight of so-called fugitive slaves and slaves who were stolen back from freedom, and this really fascinating, very, very early fight for reparations are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley, host of Oprah-demics. Going to keep saying that over and over and over until everyone listens to Oprah-demics, but hello there. Hi.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
Wood and Ward, it's going to be a whole thing this episode, but yes. And we should also say there's a phenomenal book called Sweet Taste of Liberty, written by Caleb McDaniel, that came out, a couple years ago, that sort of uncovered this story for the first time. And that's part of this as well, is that basically I think someone told him hey, you should check out this one line in this one newspaper listing in Cincinnati in the 1878, and he just then went down this rabbit hole and uncovered this whole phenomenal story. But shout out to that work.
Yeah, this book won the Pulitzer Prize in 2019, and it's amazing. I mean, there's so many different plot twists. It does feel like a movie in the way that it's sort of you think she's getting free, she's not. You think she's getting free, she's not. There's all of these different pivots. But it's so beautifully written, and it's a story that so many people did not know about until recently.
Yeah.
And such a compelling story as well. I mean, Henrietta Wood was someone who had that sort of, as she talked about it, the sweet taste of liberty after being born enslaved in Kentucky. She ultimately was granted her freedom by the person who had enslaved her, but then she was stolen back into slavery, which is something that, Kellie, maybe you can help us put this into context, but it feels like something that had happened before the Fugitive Slave Act, for sure, but that the Fugitive Slave Act accelerated the number of kidnappings and re-enslavements that were happening.
Absolutely. Kidnapping was something that enslaved people always feared, fugitive slaves always feared being caught, being recognized after they ran away. But with the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, there's a real economic incentive to get people, kidnapped essentially and sent, I can't even say back to the South, because sometimes they're taking free people and sending them to a South, to a world that they've never known. And so Henrietta gets caught up in this world as well, where people are duping other people, they are blackmailing people, they're paying off people, they're taking bribes, all in order to get as many people as they can back into this horrific system.
All under the guise of this Fugitive Slave Act, which, as amoral as it was on its own face, at least, defined a sort of people who had not been granted their freedom could be brought back. But in this case, they were exploiting that law to then basically concoct the fiction that a lot of people were, in fact, fugitive slaves and brought back. And that's what happened to Wood. So to get this timeline down, 1848, she is granted, she receives her freedom. She moves to Cincinnati. 1850, as you say, the Fugitive Slave Act passes. One of these small little twists of fate, in 1849, somewhere in there, the courthouse in Cincinnati is destroyed in a fire, and a lot of her papers and records of her freedom are destroyed there. And so all she has left is her personal copy, which then people just ignore and basically steal back from her. But then it's 5 years later, so it's like 1853 or so, that then Ward, who is the man who was her enslaver, granted her freedom, now comes back and basically says, I have an opportunity to exploit here to bring this person back into enslavement.
He sells for, is it for $300? He sells for $300 her freedom papers, essentially, and sells her off to the next person who will take her. So unbeknownst to Henrietta, she believes that she is a free person, and really she's being sold behind her back and being duped back into slavery.
And it speaks to how tenuous and how geographically dependent freedom was, because one of the ways that she gets kidnapped is she is tricked into crossing the Ohio River from Cincinnati into Kentucky. And Ohio is a free state. Kentucky is not. And so in crossing the Ohio River, she is put into an even more tenuous situation as a Black woman who only has these personal freedom papers. And thus she ends up spending another 13 years enslaved.
Yeah, and not only that, just when you think she might have a moment of emancipation, her enslavers are constantly on the run, particularly from the Union Army at this time. And so they take their enslaved property to Texas. And those who are familiar with the story of Juneteenth know that Texas sort of has a delayed emancipation. It takes a while for Union troops to get there. And when they finally get there in 1865, the majority of enslaved people are freed, but that does not come for Henrietta. Once Union troops get to Texas, her master then takes her outside of the state of Texas, and it takes about another year in order for her to find her freedom. So, these stories are so exceptional because we think that everyone gets free in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, or certainly in 65 with Juneteenth. But it does not come for much later for Henrietta.
Yeah. So she returns to Cincinnati in 1869. Once again returns to Cincinnati thinking that she's free. And in this case, the war is over. She is in Cincinnati, 1869. She has not forgotten about Ward, and she has not forgotten about this betrayal. And so she turns to the courts, which is, I think, is, an incredibly, we'll talk about the result, but, an incredibly brave act just in and of itself to say, I'm going to expose myself. I'm going to take up this fight. I'm going to go back to the courts. The legal system has betrayed this person so many times already. To then turn back to the legal system is just a remarkable act. And what is her argument? And let's talk through how this case plays out.
So she essentially sues for reparations. She basically says, I was entitled to my freedom. I was entitled to compensation, to payment. Her former master was also supposed to pay her $10 a month for, as a free person. He never pays her any salary. She never gets a dime of that money. So she sues for about $20,000, which is a lot of money then. It's a lot of money now. But when the case goes to trial, essentially she wins a victory, right? They agree that she was in fact free, but she does not get anywhere near the amount of $20,000. It's more like $2,500, which is about a tenth of what she wanted.
And worth saying that trial takes 8 years. So we're talking about 13 years after she's been freed, and then another 8 years of litigation, before we get to this very unsatisfactory ruling.
Yes, which is what, let's see, about $2,500 is about $65,000 in today's money. So it's not nothing, but at the same time, it's nowhere near what she would have been entitled to. And it still takes a while to get that. Now, eventually, her former master does pay this fine and does pay this restitution and makes her one of the few enslaved people that actually does receive reparations as a part of their enslavement. But it's so late when she receives it.
And it's a reparations that cuts against the broader call for reparations for slavery, because it holds up the logic of slavery, that there were some people who were rightfully enslaved and whose labor was rightfully taken and not compensated. But because she had been legally freed, then slavery was immoral, then slavery was illegal, and so she was entitled to some sort of reparation. So it's an important moment, right? That an all-white jury is at least ruling in her favor, even if they don't give her the money that she was entitled to. But it is a logic that upholds the system of slavery
and legitimizes it.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. I wanted to bring up one tidbit from the court case itself. Ward's lawyers, the defendant's lawyers in this case, tried a number of strategies to argue that this money was not owed. But one of those strategies was to argue that the alleged crimes, were too far in the past. Which is something we hear now about when we talk about reparations. Well, this many generations later is too far in the past. Just to be clear, in 1873, they were arguing that slavery was too far in the past.
That's wild. That's wild.
So there you go. But as we said, this ruling comes down. It is remarkable in terms of the fact that an all-white jury even goes there, but the amount of money is smaller, and moreover, in a legal sense, it is very clear, and a lot of this is on the judge who's presiding here, makes it very clear that what they are doing is basically like, this is an employment case. This is not about morality. This is not about slavery. The judge was very, very clear in his instructions to the jury and his sort of framing of the result of the trial that this was not about the legality or morality of an institution, as he put it. So I think, that's part of maybe why. I mean, you read contemporaneous reports at the time, and people talk about like, oh my gosh, this is going to set a massive precedent. There's going to be other cases like this. Is going to open the floodgates, and there really wasn't. I wonder why that is, but part of it I do think is because it was immediately framed as an employment dispute, not a judgment about.
I don't think anyone sort of had the capacity to embrace or the desire to embrace what reparations would look like for enslaved people, because it would mean that you would have to acknowledge that the system itself was wrong, that the system itself was profitable in a way that exploited people. Those acknowledgments have to take place in order for you to even talk about like what it means to sort of calculate numbers and paychecks for people. But too few people were willing to see that. I mean, they believed that slavery was a civilizing institution, that it was a good thing, that Black people were taken care of and they had shelter and they're out of pocket for paying for certain things. Like there were slaveholders that wanted reparations for the loss of their property, for their loss of their income, because slaves were wealth to them. So, and there are instances in which it's funny enough that reparations were given to slaveholders for the loss of their property. But there's not a precedent for that in the other direction.
And it's worth saying Ward, the enslaver here, died with he's multi-millionaire as a result of all the unpaid labor off which he got rich.
And just as a snapshot of what reparations might have meant and what it could have done. So Wood dies in 1912. The lawsuit was all but forgotten at that point in time. Her son, Arthur, is able to buy a house. He's able to go to law school because of the compensation that his mom received. So that idea of generational wealth and advancement was something that was made possible by even those small funds that she received. And to think about what was possible and what didn't happen is kind of heartbreaking because this one case shows what could have been.
For a lot of people, even if even a small amount of money was given, a lot could have been done, even with that.
What does that make you think about the kind of current conversation around reparations? Because I think people have, first off, I think people don't realize that there have been instances where there have been reparations. Very few, but there have been some. And, the world did not fall apart. And also, I think people tend to think of it as like, it's this massive, massive, massive thing. And it would, reorganize where we are now, which I think some people would say, yes, that's the point. But also, to your point, I do think like a small amount of money, when you think about the grand scheme of the economy and the sort of overall goals of a society, can go a long, long way.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, did Henrietta want all of her $20,000? Absolutely. Was it still something to have that $2,500? Yes. We can't discount it. But I think about like the long scheme of things and something versus nothing. And I'm always going to vote for something over nothing. And, it remains to be seen. I think lately we've gotten a lot more traction with the discussion on reparations. The fact that we can have robust conversations about reparations is something. But again, we have to get beyond like just the complex politics of it all and just get down to like what is needed. And it's really hard to do that.
I also think that in the discussion of reparations, Wood's case is especially important because it's not just compensation for the time that she was enslaved and her labor stolen. It was for the stolen labor that happens after the end of slavery. Mm-hmm. And the conversation about what reparations are for, that it's not just for enslavement, that it's for nearly a century of Jim Crow laws that also stole economic wealth and economic opportunity and the ability to have that generational wealth in housing and in education. So it helps broaden the conversation as well in the way that, Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations laid out that this is not just about enslavement. This is about the generations of stolen wealth after the end of slavery.
And can I also say stolen relationships? Because there's, not to give too much away because the book is so worth reading and it's so great, but there's a moment in which she finds her brother. They had been separated for years. Lots of enslaved families found themselves separated at the auction block, and to see this sort of like reunion and this kinship come together. It's such a beautiful telling in the story, but like we forget the sort of violence that's done to families through separation and how people have lost, entire relationships and, huge chunks of their identity because so much of the institution of slavery robbed them of that.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned that book again as we wrap up, another shout out for Sweet Taste of Liberty. And again, the story behind just how this book came to be is pretty amazing. Caleb McDaniel is sort of researching a book about people who'd been taken to Texas, and he's at a conference and he mentions to a friend, I'd love to find some more of these stories. And a few days later, that friend sends him a little clipping from an 1879 story in the Ripley Bee, which I will say I looked up, still exists, an Ohio newspaper. Good job, Ripley Bee.
Amazing.
But it's like a year after this case seems to be kind of maybe the last time this was reported on in any sort of real way. But it's an interview with Henrietta. And then, it's all the way up until the mid-2010s, that this story remains deep in the shadows and basically completely hidden. So, shout out to digging through the crates and finding.
Shout out to that colleague
Gave
who
away a
really
story,
handed
yeah.
over a big story.
I know. I hope Caleb took him out to dinner afterwards.
Right.
For sure.
But yeah, sometimes a 2-line little write-up in the Ripley Bee can really set you down a path. So go read Sweet Taste of Liberty, and that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.